Are you aware there are two versions of you? In this video, we're going to dive into the concepts of the ego and the higher self, and how understanding these will lead to a more fulfilling and authentic life. So I'm going to talk about what the ego is, what the higher self is, so you can learn to differentiate the two, because that's the first step. And then I'm going to share some different ways you can connect to your higher self and why you want to be doing this. So I have a couple of illustrations here to help teach this. So firstly, we have Dr. David Hawkins' scale of consciousness. He talks about this in his book, Power versus Force. And he calibrated this scale using kinesiology muscle testing. So these are all different levels of consciousness. They're different frequencies that you can be tuned into and vibrating on. Now, it's the ego that keeps us in the low negative frequencies. He says 85% of humans operate in the negative frequencies. And that's because most humans are operating from their egos. When you operate from your ego, you're operating in force. And he talks about in his book, Power versus Force, how force just doesn't get you the results you want. So for example, let's say you're trying to build a big successful business. You're operating from the ego, so you're operating in force. And it's like you're just hitting your head against the wall. It doesn't seem to matter what you do, you just can't get anywhere. And then courage is in blue, because courage is the critical point where you first step from force and into power. And then power is all these higher frequencies, the more positive frequencies. This is when you're operating from the soul, which is your heart. So the ego is part of the mind. The soul is connected to your heart. When you step out of the ego mind and into the heart, this is when you're connected to your soul, and then this is what raises your vibration to higher frequencies. And then this is when you're operating in power. Power is how you get the results you want. So the example he gave in the book was like, you imagine an athlete that did something so amazing, like so mind-blowing, they broke some record. It was like, how did they just do that? That was incredible. It's because they were operating in power. So this is why it's beneficial for you to learn to get out of the ego and connect to your heart and soul, so you can learn to operate in higher frequencies, operating in power, so you can get the results that you're wanting in your life. Now, the ego is the false self, and the soul is the true self. So your true essence is the soul, and when you die, the soul leaves the body and goes back to the spirit world. The ego is the false self, and the ego is important. A lot of people will give the ego a negative meaning. They will say things like, your ego is not your amigo. We need to kill our egos. We don't want to give our ego a negative meaning, because your ego is who you are. It's your sense of self. It's your identity, your likes, your dislikes, your hobbies, your morals, your beliefs. And it's the false self because your ego is like who you are. So for example, I'm Laura. That's the name of my ego. When I die, Laura will no longer exist. My ego will no longer exist. I go back into my true self, my true form. And the ego is important in order to have a human experience. So for a soul to come into physical reality, we must have an ego. We must have an identity. Because as a soul, we're all connected as one. There's the law of one, right? So we're all connected as one. So in order for the soul to have a human experience, we must have an ego, because the ego gives us the illusion of separation. It's what allows us to be an individual. That's why we have, the ego is our identity. So we don't want to give it this negative meaning, because it's important for the human experience. The key that I've learned on my journey is that it's just understanding what the ego is, so that you don't allow it to control you. Because again, it is important. Now, your ego's job is also to keep you safe. It's to survive. Dr. Joe Dispenza says in one of his books, the ego is the reason you don't just walk off a cliff or walk into a bonfire. and kill yourself. Unless you're really depressed, obviously, but the ego is designed to keep you alive. It's designed to keep you safe. And because of that reason, that's why your ego has all this negative fear-based thinking. Like all your negative fear-based thinking comes from the ego, but the ego has good intentions, which is to keep you safe. So I'll give you an analogy. So you imagine back in the day when you're, back in the caveman times, when you have to go out into the jungle to hunt your meat because we don't have supermarkets with meat. And so as you go out hunting for the meat, you might think things like, oh, we have to be careful. There might be a lion out here that's going to want to eat us. There might be a grizzly bear that's going to maul us. So it's negative thinking, but it's designed to keep you safe. That's the job of the ego. And so the ego doesn't like it when you step out of the comfort zone because the ego doesn't like the unfamiliar. So whenever you step out of your comfort zone to try something new, you might have a new opportunity presented to you. Your ego steps in with thoughts of self-doubt and how you're not good enough to do this, you're not smart enough, people are going to laugh at me. You start having those types of thoughts from the ego because the ego wants to get you back into the comfort zone. The ego wants to get you back into the familiar because it wants to keep you safe. So understanding that has improved my life because there's been times, a lot of the times I step out of my comfort zone to try something new. And now, like when the self-doubt thoughts creep into my mind, I can acknowledge it for what it is. I can, say, oh, this is just my ego that's trying to keep me safe because I understand the ego. So your ego has good intentions, but this is why you have all this negative fear-based thinking. And the problem with humans is we spend far too much time in our heads. So the interesting thing about all these different levels of consciousness is that each level of consciousness, you will view the same situation completely different. So for example, let's say you parked your car and someone hit your car. So let's say you're operating in fear. You will have a response, like a fearful response, like, oh no, someone's hit my car. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this fixed. Like you'll have some type of fearful reaction like that. However, if you were operating in anger, for example, if someone hits your car, you will get angry. Like, what the fuck are you doing, you idiot? Because you're operating in a different level of consciousness. However, let's say if you're operating up here in acceptance, which is a much higher state of consciousness, someone hits your car, you just accept the situation. Oh, if mistakes happen, it's all right. Insurance will sort it out. So you see, each of these different states of consciousness, you perceive the same situation completely different. And the higher you go up the scale of consciousness, the higher and more positive your perspective on reality will be. So this is also why raising vibration is important. This is also why at the end of this video, I'm going to share different ways you can start connecting to your higher self and getting out of the ego so you can start learning to operate in higher states of consciousness for yourself. Now, I have this drawing here that I learned this from Bashar. This is a great analogy. So here the ego is down in the valley. And the ego has a limited perspective because the ego operates in these lower states of consciousness. Then up on the mountaintop, you have your higher self. Your higher self has a better overview of your life up on the mountaintop. It has a higher perspective. Your higher self is operating in a higher state of consciousness and it is connected to your soul. And so the analogy here is that the ego wants to come up the mountain. And the ego likes to control. It thinks it knows better. And so the ego's like, I'm going to go this way to come up the mountain. But because the ego's down in the valley, it can't see the grizzly bear that's hiding in the bushes. However, the higher self, being up on the mountaintop, can see the grizzly bear. So the higher self tries to tell the ego, don't go that way, go this way. Cross the river, go around the river, cross back over the river, come between the trees and up the mountain that way. It might seem like a longer way to go, but it's the better way to go. And then the ego's like, nope, I know better because I like to control, and I'm going to go this way because it's the better way to go. So the ego doesn't listen and it goes this way and it ends up getting eaten by the grizzly bear. Or for example, you listen to your ego and then it might, self-sabotage an opportunity because it's trying to get you back into the comfort zone. So you see what I mean? If you listen to the ego, it's always going to steer you the wrong way and fuck things up, which is why it's important to learn to listen to your higher self that's operating in a higher state of consciousness, that has a better overview of your life. And when you listen to the higher self, it's always going to steer you the right way. So this is why I'm going to share some different ways that you can start connecting to the higher self, so you can listen to it, because your higher self speaks to you in the form of intuitive guidance, inner wisdom and clarity. It gives you these positive perspectives. Like, for example, I was connecting to my higher self and getting information before I even knew this concept, before I even knew about the higher self. And I'd be like puzzled with thinking negatively about something. Like, I'll have something on my mind, I'm puzzled about it, like, what am I supposed to do? And then out of nowhere, this positive wisdom and clarity, this positive perspective will just come in and completely shift the way that I looked at the situation. And it was like, where did this come from? It was pretty random, the way it just randomly came in and gave me that information. And then it was much later that I learned about the ego and the higher self, and I realized, oh, that was my higher self connecting to me. So you can literally connect to your higher self every day and receive guidance every single day. So the first way you can do this is using mindfulness and meditation. So mindfulness is what gets you into the present moment. And when you're in the present moment, it dissolves your ego. Because a lot of the times we're not in the present moment. We're either worrying about the past, or we're worrying about the future, and we're not really in the here and now. When you get into the here and now, it dissolves your ego. And then that's when you can start receiving the information from your higher self. Because as long as you're in your head and your ego, because your ego is really loud, your ego is a lot louder than your higher self. So when you're in your head and your ego's going at you, you can't hear your intuitive guidance. You can't hear from your higher self over the ego. So this is why the key is getting into the present moment to dissolve the ego using mindfulness, and then you can start receiving the guidance. And another one is meditation, right? So as you go into a meditative state, what happens is, you close your eyes, you disconnect from the external environment, so there's less sensory information going in. And because there's less sensory information going in, your neocortex will start dropping your brainwaves. And the key is to drop from beta brainwave, which is the brainwave you're in when you're awake, alert, and aware. You go into alpha, which is the more relaxed state, and then you want to drop into theta brainwave, which is when you enter your subconscious mind. But when you drop into theta brainwave, you also drop from your head and into your heart. And when that happens, your ego goes completely quiet. You have no thoughts. You just become pure consciousness. You're just awareness. You're the soul. You're sitting in your heart, not up here. And like I said, humans spend too much time in their heads, not in their bodies. And this is why 85% of humans are operating, on the negative frequencies. So by going into a meditative state, you drop out of the ego, you're in your body, you can start receiving information from your higher self. Meditation is also a really great practice for observing the ego mind, because the ego mind has all this chatter, and we have these thought loops, which are just, thought patterns that are programs. So by using meditation to observe the ego mind, you can start becoming familiar with your ego patterns. And that way it stops those ego patterns from controlling you. Now, the second tip I have for connecting to your higher self is something as simple as going for a walk in nature. So there's been times where I've had a problem on my mind and I don't know what to do. I'm puzzled. I've got this negative perspective. So I decided to go for a walk in nature. And this is because nature grounds you in the body. So the key to connecting to your higher self is getting in the body, connecting to the heart, getting out of the head. So when you go out into nature, it grounds you in the body, dissolves the ego, and then you can start channeling information from your higher self. So I've literally gone for a walk in nature, puzzled with something on my mind, and as crazy as it sounds, I literally have conversations going back and forth between me and my higher self. So not out loud, but like I'll be walking in nature and I'll just think, what the heck do I do about this thing? And I'm just walking and then the information comes up. Oh, you should do this. And it's like, okay. And then I'll talk back to it in my mind. So blah, 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 whatever I say back, and then it will respond. And it's not like you're being schizophrenic where you're hearing different voices. It's still you, but it's almost like there's two versions of you inside, or maybe even three. I'm still confused about that because I think, who's the one that's talking to the higher self? Is that my ego, or is there a third person? Like, I don't know, but I have this conversation going between me and the higher self anyways. And like, you can go back and forth, and it basically brings you the information that helps you figure out what to do with your problems. So you just go for a walk in nature. It's a simple thing to do. Now, a third tip to connect to your higher self is what's called automatic writing, which is journaling, and you can channel your higher self through journaling. And I did this before I even knew about automatic writing. So again, I had some sort of problem on my mind. Actually, someone had really screwed me over. Someone I thought was a good friend I could trust screwed me over, and I was so angry that I was like, I need to journal this out. I need to get it out of my internal environment. So I started journaling on paper, and I ended up channeling my higher self. And what ended up happening, it was really interesting. My handwriting starts speeding up because I was downloading a lot of information. So I'm trying to keep up with the information that is coming through. And what I noticed is when I first started writing, I was writing I blah, 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 I blah, 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 I whatever I was saying. And then as I started channeling my higher self, my handwriting speeds up, and I noticed the I changed to you, blah, 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 blah. You, like as if someone else is talking to me, telling me you should be doing this. Do you know what I mean? And I was like, that was an interesting thing to notice in my, journaling. And then the information that comes through in the journaling session, it's like, tips to know that you've connected to your higher self is, it's inspiring information. It's uplifting. It resonates with your soul. It gets you excited. Like it feels really good. You're like, yeah, this is what I needed to hear, or this is going to help me. That's how you know that you're connected to your higher self. And so you can just, go into a journaling session, write whatever's coming up in your internal environment, get it out on paper, and you can just, channel information from your higher self that way. But you can also use journaling as a way to become aware of your ego patterns as well. So journaling is really a great tool, in my opinion, for like working with your internal environment. And your internal environment is what is creating the external environment, because everything outside of us is just a projection. It's a mirror of what's going on internally. So I highly recommend like starting up a journaling practice to work with your internal environment and get yourself into more positive states, as well as channeling this information. And the fourth tip to connect to your higher self is to follow your excitement and passion. So Bashar says your excitement and passion is communication from your higher self. So what excites you? What are you passionate about? And go do that. And because we're in the age of social media, we can monetize our passions now. We can use social media to create businesses and sell our products. And so as long as you follow your excitement and passion, and you listen to your higher self, and you're able to channel and download information, it will always steer you right in life. It will lead you to be able to create a better reality for yourself. So I'm at the point where I've learnt to differentiate the two, the ego and the higher self, so that I know who's talking to me. I know when to listen and when not to listen. And this was something that I just strengthened over time through trial and error. There were times that I had intuitive guidance come to me, I listened to it and I realized I'm so glad I listened. That really saved my ass. There were times where it came and I didn't listen and I regretted it. And I was like, man, I wish I listened to that. So through trial and error is how I really got more and more familiar with the two, to the point now where I know exactly which is which. Another tip I'll give you with the ego, because the ego is the false self, it's recommended to separate yourself from the ego. So some people suggest giving your ego a different name. Like they'll say, oh, call it Jessica. For me, that doesn't resonate, because I'm like, well, my name's Laura, that's the name of my ego. So for me, I just call it the ego. I don't give it a name. I just say, so if my ego's talking to me with like negative, fear-based thoughts and it's basically being a dick, I'll just tell the ego in a friendly way, because remember, the ego has good intentions, just wants to keep us safe, but I just say in a friendly way, like, ego, go sit in the corner, like as a joke. Or I'll just be like, thanks for your concern, ego, but I don't want to listen to you right now. I just want to hear from my higher self. So I highly recommend doing that to like separate yourself from your ego, because it's not who you truly are. It's your false self. It's, you aren't your thoughts or feelings. You're the conscious awareness that can take the step back and observe your thoughts and feelings. So you don't need to be identifying with your thoughts, which is what a lot of people do. They think they are their thoughts, and it's just their egos with all that internal chatter. So again, in order to connect to the higher self, the key really is to get in your body and connect to your heart, getting out of the head. As long as you're up here in the head, the ego is going to be chattering away and you're not going to be able to receive your intuitive guidance. So I hope you like this video and you got some sort of value out of it. And if you did, let me know by hitting the like button or write a comment. And it also helps the video get pushed out to more people. I'm going to link a video at the end of this one that's going to teach you how to heal the ego, because a lot of us are walking around with wounded egos. And I was one of these people. Like, I've had to work on healing my ego. So there's a lot of people walking around with wounded egos, which is where all the self-sabotaging behaviors come from, and all the negativity and projection. And so by working with the ego to heal it, that's what will help you go from having a wounded ego to a healthy ego. And when you have a healthy ego, life is a lot better, life's a lot easier. The ego's not going to be fucking up all these, fucking things up for you. And so I highly recommend checking that video out. So I'm going to link it at the end of this one. And if you like this sort of content, hit the subscribe and the bell notification. Have an awesome day. Peace.